Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another daily dose of stories of new Capenna spoilers, and do we have some sweet stuff today. We got one of my favorite mythics that Wizards has maybe ever printed, a ton of other really cool stuff, which means we should probably jump right into it. Start dogging sweet new Capenna cards. Before we do, two quick reminders. Number one, if you want to keep up on all the latest spoilers throughout the day, you'll find them all over at MTGpreviews.com. Number two, if you need some new Capenna cards, or any cards for that matter, you can get them from our amazing sponsor, Card Kingdom, by heading over to cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish, and even get a free goldfish sticker. Just let them know you want one in your order notes, and they'll hook you up. Anyway, let's talk Streets of New Capenna. First up today, we got one of my favorite cards that Wizards has made in a very long time in Burglar's Halo Stash. So Burglar's Halo Stash, beautiful in its simplicity. It's a 6-mana green artifact that says lands you control have tapped to create a treasure token. When you first read this card, you're kind of like, all right, Wizards, like, thanks for this 6-mana mythic that makes my lands that already tap for mana, like, well done, thanks a lot. But when you start to think about all the things this card can do, it is really absurd. So on level 1, no additional support, you essentially get yourself an upwelling or turn your lands into weird storage lands, because worst case, you can tap all your lands every turn, turn that mana into treasures, and then you'll have those treasures to spend on the next turn. So you're kind of just like upwelling, making your mana not empty at the end of turns and phases. You're storing it up with treasure tokens, which by itself is actually pretty powerful. Like, you're always going to get mana efficiency out of your lands, even if you don't have something to spend it on right away. But it gets way better than that. Let's say you add a Seedborn Muse or a Wilderness Reclamation to the mix. Then this thing makes a ridiculous amount of mana. Seedborn Muse untaps all of your permanents on your opponent's untap steps. So especially in Commander, this means you get to untap your lands 4 times each turn cycle. With a Burglar's Halo Stash, you can just make treasures every single time. Every single one of your lands is going to make a treasure on each of your opponent's turns, and it solves one of Seedborn Muse's problems. Like, Seedborn Muse is a really powerful card, but untapping your lands on everyone's turn isn't always all that valuable, because if you don't have instants, that mana often ends up going to waste. This means all of your lands are going to be put to use no matter what every single turn with Seedborn Muse, which is kind of busted. Then you have token synergies, treasure synergies. Like, if you have a Doubling Season, or a Kaya, or a Zorn, or Anointed Procession, or a Parallel Lives, this essentially just doubles your mana. And if you have multiples of these, then it's tripling your mana, because you're making 3 times as many treasure tokens. Also, like, Goldspan Dragon doubles your mana, because all your treasures make 2 mana. You can use something like Ginny Fae to turn your treasures into creatures, so now all of your lands would have tap to make a 2/2 Hasty Cat or a 3/1 Dog with Vigilance, which is pretty sweet. It works incredibly well with sacrifice synergies. Now, rather than making normal mana, all of your lands are making treasure mana, and you gotta sack treasures to get the mana, so it's pinging with your Mayhem Devil, it's growing your Ravenous Squirrel, it's drawing you cards with Corvold Faker's Cake, which is kind of absurd. It works with other just straight up treasure synergies, Magda, or Professional Facebreaker, Security Rock, Stimulus Package. All these cards are even in Standard. Like, you could build a treasure deck in Standard, and Burglar's Halo Stash, sure, it's making mostly the same amount of mana, unless you throw a Goldspan into the mix, but even without making extra mana, just the fact that you can turn your lands into card draw with Professional Facebreaker, or turn them into tokens with Stimulus Package, or maybe tutor up a dragon or an artifact with Magda is really, really strong. And then you got all kinds of other artifact synergies. You got stuff that hurts your opponent when an artifact leaves the battlefield. Disciple of the Vault. You sack an artifact, your opponent gets drained. If you have Burglar's Halo Stash, all of your lands are tapped to drain for 1. Same with Reckless Fireweaver. When an artifact enters the battlefield, you ping each opponent for 1. So all your lands have tapped to deal a damage to each opponent. You have stuff like Affinity for artifacts like Tezzeret, Master of the Bridge, where your artifacts are going to give you a huge cost reduction. And then you have all these sweet Commander synergies where you got like Lannis shenanigans, where Lannis is wanting to make a bunch of tokens. Sure, it makes clues, but if you throw Academy Manufacturer into the mix, all your lands are going to also be making clues. You got Adrix and Nev, which is just a token doubler from the command zone. You got Merrick, which wants you to sacrifice things because it grows all of your creatures every time you sack something. So all of a sudden, all of your lands have tap to give your entire team a +1/+1 counter. This card does so many things. It's also, I believe, the easiest way to win with Revel and Riches. We actually have coming up tonight, Revel and Riches against the Odds and Pioneer, and we had to go through some great hoops, jump through some really, really big ones to actually pull it off. Now we got Burglar's Halo Stash, which is just such an easy way. You play Revel and Riches, spend 2 turns tapping your lands to make treasures, and win the game with Revel and Riches. No other support needed. It's essentially Splinter Twin with Suspend 2 that involves treasures and a bunch of expensive artifacts and enchantments, but still it's a 2 2-card combo that can win the game really quickly. So Burglar's Halo stash, I love this card. I think this card is going to be an all-star in Commander. I'm excited to play it in Standard in the right deck. If you have these synergies, it is going to be really, really powerful. So it is 6 mana. It is a little bit slow, but it does so many cool things that I just really can't wait to start brewing with this card because it is just so incredibly cool. Next up, we get a little Esper removal in Void Rend. Oh my goodness, this card's brutal. So 3 mana, Esper Colors instant. This spell can't be countered. Destroy target non-land permanent. This is just a premium removal spell. The only like pseudo downside of this card is that it costs 3 mana, but this is like Abrupt Decay on steroids. Abrupt Decay sees a lot of play across formats simply because it can't be countered. Yes, you gotta pay 1 more mana for Void Rend, but you get to hit anything. There's no 3 mana or less restriction. This is just gonna blow up any single thing that can show up on the battlefield, and your opponent's gonna have a really, really hard time dealing with it. And we see other cards with this mechanic, the can't be countered mechanic, Dovin's Veto, Supreme Verdict, Abrupt Decay, really be cross-format staples. These are some of the most played multicolor cards in Commander. They see play in Pioneer, Historic, Modern, you name the format. These cards are seeing play in it because your opponent not being able to counter your stuff is a really, really huge upside. So in Commander, I think this is Beast Within Generous Gift level. Like, of course you gotta be Esper or 4 colors or 5 colors. So the number of homes is a little bit limited because of color identity, but this is a premium removal spell. Yes, you can't hit lands, which is a tiny bit of a drawback, but it makes up for that by being uncounterable. So if you're in the Esper colors, this is in your removal package 100%. And I think that this is also going to see play potentially across formats in 60 card formats as well. Like in Standard, this is going to join Vanishing Verse to give Esper control decks just a ridiculous removal suite. And Vanishing Verse gets a little bit worse now that we're going into a multicolored world. So this is a big boost in power to like Esper control in Standard. I think we'll see this in Esper control style decks in Historic, in Pioneer, in Modern. It'll probably show up in some number in Legacy even. This card is just absolutely insane and busted. One other trick to mention with this card is, especially in Standard, this is a way to get around Ward as well. It might not be obvious at first glance, but what Ward does is it counters the spell if you don't pay the Ward cost. So take, let's say, Imarith, for example. It has Ward 4 as long as it's untapped, which normally means if you target it, you're gonna have to pay 4 extra mana, but if you kill it with Void Rend, you can choose not to pay the mana, but Ward won't be able to counter your Void Rend, so you still kill the Imarith. Same with like Sedgemoor Witch, you don't have to pay the 3 life. Same with Hall of the Storm Giants, you don't have to pay the 3 mana. So keep that in mind. If you play this like on Arena, you're still gonna get the pop-up for Ward. It's still gonna say, would you like to pay the 4 or whatever, but don't do it. Say no, because your spell's uncounterable. It's gonna resolve anyway, so say no to the trigger if you're killing stuff with Void Rend. So Void Rend, just a great removal spell, like one of the best removal spells we've seen in a long time. The only thing that gives me any little catch about it is it is 3 mana. If you're up against a super aggro deck in an older format, 3 mana can be a little bit slow if you're just getting beaten down by Dragon Rage Channelers and Ragavans and whatever, but it makes up for that by not being counterable and its insane flexibility of hitting any non-land permanent. So this card is just, wow, one of the best removal spells Wizards has printed in a very long time. We also got a sweet little Pegasus, Park Heights Pegasus, a 2-mana Selesnya 2/1 Pegasus with flying and trample, so a flampler. And it says, whenever Park Heights Pegasus deals combat damage to a player, draw a card if 2 or more creatures entered the battlefield under your control this turn. So Park Heights Pegasus, it's kind of like a weird twist on a Shadow Mage Infiltrator and Ophidian. You get a pretty decent body, a 2-mana 2/1 flying trample, like that's not bad, but you do have to go through a little bit of work if you want to turn it into a Dark Confidant, where you're drawing an extra card every single turn. You're gonna have to play some sort of token deck, some sort of deck built around having multiple creatures come into play each turn. Thankfully, there's a lot of ways to do this, like Azeka's Chariot, that's 3 creatures by itself. Adeline enters the battlefield, it's a creature, when you attack, it makes a token, that's 2 creatures. Clarion Spirit, Join the Dance, Scoot Swarm, Minsk Beloved Rager. So there's plenty of ways to build around this. You could also just play an aggro deck where you're trying to like play this on turn 2 and then turn 3 go 1-drop, 2-drop, get in, draw a card, try to snowball it that way. So I actually think that this card has enough easy synergies to see play in Standard. Like, I think that it's reasonable enough, and you don't have to draw that many cards to make it worth it. If you can draw 2 cards out of this and get in 4 damage, like, that's already a win. It's not like you gotta do this for the whole game to make it worthwhile. And then in Commander, Commander, this seems pretty good for any sort of token deck. Like, if you're playing a token deck that's consistently going to be adding multiple creatures to the battlefield each turn, this is just draw an extra card each turn, a nice little source of card advantage. So I definitely consider it for like Jetmir and Tristani and Gyrid and Reese. So Park Heights Pegasus might not look like much, but I actually think in the right deck, it's a really powerful 2-drop. We also got another new vehicle, a really weird vehicle, but one that I think is super powerful in Unlicensed Hearse. So Unlicensed Hearse, 2-mana star. It has crew of 2. You can tap it to exile up to 2 target cards from a single graveyard, and its power and toughness are equal to the number of cards exiled with it. So normally, when we talk about constructed playable vehicles, we're looking for flying, really. And this definitely doesn't have flying. It doesn't have any evasion at all. However, I think that this is actually the exception to the rule, because you're not playing this to be a great creature. You're playing this as kind of a hate card. Like, we're in a standard with quite a few graveyard synergies. You got Leer decks, you got flashback spells, you got disturb stuff, you got Kamiya Transias coming back from the graveyard. We got the new 5 different mana values in your graveyard mechanic coming in Streets of New Capenna. This is just a card that you can play and keep your opponent's graveyard empty, and then as you're going through the graveyard exiling, this eventually just turns into a big threat. After 3 or 4 turns, this is potentially going to be a 6/6 or an 8/8, which is fine. It's only got crew 2, so in the early game, it's kind of your graveyard hang, and then in the late game, it can turn into your finisher, which kind of makes it like a Scavenging Ooze or a Lion Sash, except it even has some upsides there. Like, Scavenging Ooze and Lion Sash, they have a downside, which is if you play them on turn 2, you can't immediately exile a card from your opponent's graveyard because you need mana to do that. Unlicensed Hearse comes down, it's not a creature, so there's no summoning sickness, so you can immediately on turn 2 tap it to snipe 2 things from the graveyard, which in a format like Modern is actually a really big deal. There's definitely been games, especially when you're on the draw and you're playing against Dredge or Reanimator or something, where you have the Ooze in hand and you cast it and you're like, oh my goodness, if we untap this is going to be good, but then your opponent does their big thing when you don't have mana to activate Ooze. Unlicensed Hearse gets around that. So in some ways, I think that Scavenging Cruise, as I've heard it called, might actually be better than Scavenging Ooze and Lion Sash, especially in older formats. And in older formats, you got tons of things to hate on. Like, you got Arclight Phoenix decks in Historic, you got Dredge decks, you got Reanimator decks. So many decks use the graveyard in some form or another. And I think this is actually in the conversation alongside Relic of Progenitus, Soul Guide Lantern, Rest in Peace, Leyline of the Void, as an option to be playable in these formats, because it turns into a big creature. So like I mentioned before, in the early game, this is great graveyard hate, and then in the late game, it actually becomes the biggest threat on the table. I think it's really going to depend on the deck you're playing. I think, especially in older formats, if you're considering Unlicensed Hearse, you got to have artifact synergies, you got to be a vehicle deck, you got to have a bunch of creatures so you can crew it, so you need it in specific decks, and there are some drawbacks, like you can snag a Soul Guide Lantern or Relic with Urza Saga. You can't do that with Unlicensed Hearse. Rest in Peace, Leyline of the Void are just super hard graveyard hate. Unlicensed Hearse only gets 2 cards a turn, potentially. But still, I think this card is worth keeping in mind in older formats and definitely in standard. And if you're playing some sort of artifact or vehicle commander deck, I really like this card. We always harp on needing to play more graveyard hate in commander. The problem is playing an actual graveyard hate spell just feels kind of bad. You don't want to play a Rest in Peace usually because it just doesn't do anything cool, and you want to play cool cards in commander. So cards like Unlicensed Hearse are a way that you can play something that you should be playing in your deck anyway, so you don't get wrecked by the Reanimator deck or whatever. And you still have a pretty sweet card that's going to grow into a big creature that can do more things than just like randomly hose the graveyard. So definitely in the conversation there as well. So Unlicensed Hearse, I really like this card. I think definitely see standard play. It'll show up in some commander decks, and I wouldn't even be surprised if specific decks in older formats add it to their decks. If not main deck, then sideboard is one of their graveyard hate spells. Next up, we got a pretty sweet Azorius 2-drop in Scheming Accomplice. So 2 mana, 2/3 human citizen. When it enters the battlefield, choose a non-land permanent. Activated abilities of chosen permanent can't be activated, and Scheming Accomplice has all the activated abilities of the chosen permanent, except for loyalty abilities, and you spend mana as though as mana of any color to activate that. So Scheming Accomplice is essentially a weird twist on a Pithing Needle or a Sorcerer Spy class, also a little reminiscent of Meddling Mage, just as a 2-drop hate card in Azorius. So essentially the difference is Pithing Needle, you just name any card when it comes into play. So you can name Jason Mind Sculptor, whether there's a Jason Mind Sculptor on the battlefield or not. Scheming Accomplice has to name a card that's already on the battlefield, a non-land permanent that is already on the battlefield. So that means you gotta wait for your opponent to play their Jace, or play their whatever, which I think is actually kind of an issue with this card. You can't just run this out on turn 2. and name Loth, or run it out on turn 2 and name Wandering Emperor or something. So it's a 2-drop that you really can't play easily on turn 2 because the abilities you want to shut down aren't going to be on the battlefield on turn 2, which I think is a really big problem in terms of how strong this card will actually be. On the other hand, it can shut down Planeswalkers. You gotta wait and play this, on turn 4, on turn 5 after on their battlefield. Your opponent gets to activate them once, but it is still a way that this is a 2-3 for 2 that stops your opponent from activating their Planeswalkers. And then there are some interesting abilities to steal, like playing this and naming Reckoner Bankbuster, and then you have a Scheming Accomplice that can pay 2 and tap to draw a card, etc, etc, etc. You can name Kenrith maybe in some matchups and get all Kenrith's abilities, which is kind of hilarious. So it seems like a really fun card that can do kind of interesting things. Also worth pointing out that it doesn't say that mana abilities are accepted, so you can play this and name a Llanowar Elves or whatever and shut down its mana ability and turn Scheming Accomplice into a Mana Dork itself. Same with Birds of Paradise or a Mox or a Sylvan Caryatid. So Scheming Accomplice, I like this card. I think this card's cool. I like the ability stealing aspect of the card, but when I think about how it's going to play in practice, I'm a little skeptical that it can be anything more than maybe a targeted sideboard card, because a big piece of the power of something like Pithing Needle or Sorcerer's Spyglass is you know what your opponent's deck is. You know what card you're trying to shut down, and you can just run it out on turn 1 or turn 2 and shut down the important thing to keep it from coming down and being a problem later. Scheming Accomplice can't do that, so the timing issue is kind of a little bit of a problem, but we'll have to wait and see. Maybe it's going to be better than I think, and we'll have to see what other activated abilities are running around. We also got a new Naya Sweeper, an Incandescent Aria, a 3-mana Naya sorcerer that says it deals 3 damage to each non-token creature, and honestly, there's not a ton to say about this card. This is a Anger the Gods or Slagstorm or Sweltering Suns. Downside is you gotta be in 3 colors. Upside is if you're a token deck, it's kind of absurd because it's not gonna hurt your creatures. It's one-sided. So this is a card that if you are a token deck and you're in the right colors and you want a sweeper, it's awesome. It's great. It's going to be one of the better cards in your deck. On the other hand, if you're not a token deck, you'll probably just play the Anger of the Gods or the Slagstorm or the Sweltering Sun or whatever. In Standard, there's not a ton of other options, so if you're in Standard, not even non-tokens and you need a sweeper, you still probably play it. But I think that's basically where the card falls. Like, we've seen a lot of very similar cards in the past. Huge upside for token decks. Otherwise, it's just another Anger of the Gods. We also got, a pretty sweet Naya 4-drop in Fleetfoot Dancer, a 4-mana Naya 4/4 Elf Druid with very simple text: trample, lifelink, and haste. And I think the combination of mechanics and stats on this card means it's got a really good chance to see a lot of standard play. If you think about what this is, it kind of compares to a Questing Beast and Uvin Wild Oddity, both cards that have seen a decent amount of play in standard. Like hasty 4/4s for 4 with additional upside are pretty good in standard. Of course, you do gotta be a Naya to really make this work, but I really, really love the combination of lifelink and haste. Those are 2 really strong abilities put together, with trample thrown in as a bonus. What this means is, against a control style deck, this is a great way to snipe a Planeswalker. Like, this comes down hastily, smashes in, kills a Kaido or an Elspeth or a Wandering Emperor. So really, really solid against control style decks for that reason. Also just against control, good way to rebuild after a Wrath. Your opponent wraths the board, you get them low with your aggro creatures in the early game, then something like this comes down and is a good way to close out the game, get in those last few points of damage. So good against control, and then lifelink means this is actually like really strong against aggro. Against aggro, you don't care so much about getting in that hasty attack, you care about the life that it's gaining, and because of haste, you can gain that life right away, or you can sit back on defense and have this big lifelinking blocker. So this is one of those cards that it's got good stats, it's got good abilities, it feels pretty good against control, it feels pretty good against aggro, which I think just makes it a good card. Also, pretty sweet with the treasure plan when you consider that we're going into a standard with Magda and Prosperous Innkeeper and Black Market Tycoon, all in Fleetfoot Dancer's colors, and probably all pretty playable in standard. We've already seen like Magda and Innkeeper be very, very good, and Black Market Tycoon probably joins the mix. Pretty good chances can be coming down consistently on turn 3, and that makes it an even more exciting threat. The only mark against this is we do have some really good instant speed removal. When you consider that Valorous Stance is the most played removal spell right now in the format, or non-creature removal spell at least. When you consider that, it does make Fleetfoot Dancer a little bit weaker. Obviously, it's got by Infernal Grasp and Void Rend, but at least it dodges Vanishing Verse, so that's nice. And I don't think this is a deal breaker. This isn't a Dice to Doomblade argument, but it is worth keeping in mind that it's a little bit annoying that Valorous Stance hits it. But Fleetfoot Dancer, card seems legit. Like I said, good against control, good against aggro, good stats, calls back to cards that in the very recent past have been very strong. This isn't one of those, 15 years ago a card like this was good. This is like, right now, even while a lot of DCs play, or like a couple years ago, Questing BCs playing a really, really powerful effect. So I have very high hopes for Fleetfoot Dancer. The only concern, outside of the removal thing, is the color good? And that's always the question when you have these 3 color cards. Even if Fleetfoot Dancer is great, the rest of its color combination has to be good enough to make a Naya deck work in Standard, or it won't see play. So fingers crossed for that. But if there's a good Naya creature deck, I expect that Fleetfoot Dancer are going to be a big reason why. We also got our red hideaway enchantment in widespread thievery. In this one, pretty interesting. So 3 mana red enchantment, hideaway 5 of course, says whenever you cast a multicolor spell, make a treasure token, and then you can pay 5 mana, Wooburg, 1 of each color, and if you do, you can cast the exiled card without paying its mana cost. So this is one of those weird good news, bad news situations. So on one hand, unlike every single other hideaway enchantment in the cycle, you actually got to pay a lot of mana, 5 mana, to cast the card that you hide away. So you don't just get to achieve a goal, meet a certain criteria, and get the card for free, which is a pretty big drawback. Like, a big upside of a lot of these hideaway cards is eventually you're getting a free card out of it. Widespread Thievery, never going to give you a free card. So that is the bad news. The good news is, I think this is arguably just a playable card on its own, even if you never really cast the free card, or if that's like your backup plan. Just when you cast a multicolor spell, make a treasure token. That's kind of like Burglar for multicolor spells. We've seen Burglar be pretty strong. Just cast a spell, make a mana. Widespread Thievery only works with multicolor spells, but if you're cast a multicolor spell, it's even better than Burglar. You're getting a treasure that you can use right away, or you can wait on, and it makes mana of any color. So I think that just, even without the hideaway part, this is a card that really interests me. In Standard, I'm super excited to try it with Bard class. Bard class tends to have a lot of multicolor legends anyway, so this is going to make a bunch of treasures, and then maybe use your treasures to cast it for free, so it seems like a cool addition there. Other synergies like Manamorphose, all of a sudden is a ritual that's generating mana because of the treasure. Burning Tree Emissary gets really crazy because it's actually generating that mana now, rather than just breaking even on mana. So I think that in some sort of multicolor shenanigan deck, even if you never really plan on casting the hideaway card, this could be worth it just as this weird combo piece mana generating effect. Also seems really sweet with all the treasure synergies we got in Standard. Like, we have a bunch of sweet treasure stuff, like Ginny Faye, for example, in the right colors. You can turn the treasures, if you want to, into creatures. We got Stimulus Package, turn the treasures into creatures. And then we got a lot of just like good multicolor cards, like the Fleetfoot Dancer we were just talking about. Like, that's a card you just want in your deck anyway because it's good, and now it's coming along with a bonus of a treasure token. So I feel like it's pretty easy in our future Standard, with all of our new Street of Capenna multicolor stuff, to build a deck where this is just going to be really strong. So I like it a lot. The only thing I'll say about it is it is kind of disappointing for Commander because of the pay Wooburg aspect. This isn't a mono red card in Commander. It's a 5-color card, which really limits the decks that you want to play it in. The one deck where I think it's going to be an all-star is Niv Mizzet Reborn. Niv Mizzet, 5 colors, and it specifically cares about multicolor cards. So Widespread Thievery seems great there. I guess you could also play it in maybe like Joder or something, just 5-color decks that care about big things and actually try to build around the hideaway mode of it, because it does seem pretty easy to turn on. Like, the downside is you got to pay 5 mana. The upside is the condition is cast a multicolor spell. That's all you got to do. So you're going to be able to turn it on really quickly, but you got to pay 5 mana for it. But if you're getting something massive for that 5 mana, it's still pretty powerful as a wrap spell. So limited in Commander, but I'm actually really excited about this. I think the hideaway mode is the worst of the bunch because you got to pay for it, but it is the easiest to achieve. And even if you never achieve it in the right deck, this offers a lot of value. Speaking of multicolor cards, we got an interesting Rakdos sorcery in Corpse Explosion. 3 mana sorcery says an additional cost to cast a spell, exile a creature card from your graveyard, and then Corpse Explosion deals damage equal to the exiled creature's power to each creature in each planeswalker. So Corpse Explosion can be a 3 mana hard wrath. It also hits planeswalkers, but it's a little risky. You gotta have a big creature in your graveyard to do it. When you consider that something like Fated Retribution, which is destroy all creatures and planeswalkers, is 7 mana, this is really, really efficient for what you're getting. However, to make it work, you're gonna have to get those cards in your graveyard. You gotta be a specific deck. It reminds me a little bit of like Draconic Intervention, where Draconic Intervention kinda does the same thing, except you gotta exile an instant or sorcery from your graveyard, and it triggers based on its mana. mana value, we've seen Draconic Intervention see a little bit of play in Standard, which is kind of weird. I thought it would be better with like Magma Opus, easy ways to get big spells in your graveyard, but it hasn't really fully taken off. But Corpse Explosion, we got the pieces to make it work. It seems perfect for some sort of graveyard deck, reanimator deck. We're going to be trying to get Tox Rolls or whatever in your graveyard anyway, and then if you're exiling a Tox Roll, sure, it's a bummer that it's not going to be there to be able to be reanimated, but you're still dealing 7 to everything. That is a hard wrath for 3 mana, so it's very above the curve if you can pull it off and make it work. Like, if you can get the big thing in your graveyard, this is a really, really cheap version of its effect. So Corpse Explosion, I think it's got a chance to be quite strong in Standard and in Commander, but you gotta be in a pretty specific archetype to make it work, and there's gonna be risk that if you get hit by Graveyard Hate or something, then this is kind of doing literally nothing. So high reward, being a really efficient wrath for creatures and planeswalkers, but also a lot of risk involved, because if your graveyard gets shut down, or you draw a little clunky and can't get the big thing in your graveyard to exile, then it's gonna do not really much at all. We also got even more treasure production in Ognis the Dragon's Lash. And wow, can this card do some things. If there's one thing we've learned from New Capenna, it's that Wizards really loves treasure cards at the moment, treasure tokens. So this is one of those weird hybrid cards, technically a Jund card, but you can cast it for mono red, you can cast it for Rakdos, you can cast it for Gruul, or for full on Jund. It's a 4 mana 3/3 legendary Vishino warrior with haste, and it says when a creature you control with haste attacks, create a tapped treasure token. So obviously tap means you can't use the mana right away, which is a bit of a drawback, but still, this card can make an absurd amount of mana. Just look at Standard. This is just me kind of searching up the stuff to build a haste deck in these colors. There are a ton of already played cards that just naturally have haste, from 1-drops like Rabbit Battery up to Goldspan Dragon, which obviously absurd because you get double treasure mana and Volatile Arsonist. So if you want to build a haste deck with this, you certainly can and make a ridiculous amount of mana. And even though there's not any specific plan for using that mana, it doesn't really matter. Having a ton of mana is never a bad thing. So I think this card can be pretty strong played fairly, is an actual haste tribal card. Another place I'm interested in it is we played a week or two ago for Budget Magic a Invigorating Hot Springs Modify deck, and Ognis actually seems really sweet there. Goro Goro gives your entire team haste. Invigorating Hot Springs gives your modified creatures haste, plus you got some stuff like Thundering Raju. This could be an interesting addition just to make a bunch of mana in the deck and make dragons with Goro Goro, whatever you're trying to do. So you got some natural mana sinks built in as well, so I would definitely consider playing it in the Invigorating Hot Springs Modify deck. And then there's Mass Haste in Standard. Like, if you don't want to play a bunch of haste creatures, you can just play Tuk Tuk Robber 4 or Goro Goro, or level up a Barbarian class and give all of your stuff haste, so every creature's making a treasure token. And then we got lots of treasure synergies, which might be an even more powerful way to build around this. Goldspan Dragon to double the mana, Professional Facebreaker to turn it into card draw, Magna to tutor up dragons, Zorn to make even more treasure. So there's a lot of possibilities with this card in Standard, although it is worth mentioning it's only a 3/3 for 4, so it is a hill giant, which is not super scary stats, even with haste and the upside of its ability. There's a lot of other synergies though, like the synergies just keep going. Dragon Spark Reactor, all the treasures, turning that on to deal 10 of damage. You can turn the treasures into actual creatures with Jinny Fae. We mentioned Goldspan for doubling the treasures. And then once you get to Commander, in Commander, it's really easy to give your team haste. Like, that's what Red does. You got Fervors and Rhythm of the Wilds and Angers and Sammets and Perforasis and good Urabras. So really, really easy in Commander to just give everyone haste, and then you don't got to deal with playing janky haste creatures. You get to play good creatures and still benefit from Ognis. And if you want to go infinite with this card, it's actually not that hard. The main thing keeping it from just really easily going infinite is the treasures coming into play tapped, but there's a solution to that in Amulet of Vigor. Amulet of Vigor just untaps your treasures, so then if you add in a Hellkite Charger or add in an Aggravated Assault and you got a bunch of creatures on the battlefield and everything has haste, you just attack and then take an extra combat and then attack and take an extra combat using your treasure mana to keep it going and kind of get that Najeela style infinite combat step win. So I think that that's probably something you'll see in Ognis decks. And then there's other directions to go too. It works really well with sacrifice effects, obviously. Treasures, easy to sacrifice. Works well with token themes like Doubling Season. So Ognis, card's kind of insane. It's a really, really powerful effect. We'll see if its hill giant stats are too much for it to overcome in Standard, but the upside of this card in the right deck is you're attacking and making 4 mana, 8 mana, 10 mana every single turn, and even if you got a waited turn to use it because the treasures come into play tapped, it is still very, very strong. We also got a weird blue rare in Reservoir Kraken, a 4-mana 6/6 Kraken with trample and ward 2, and it says, at the beginning of each combat, if Reservoir Kraken is untapped, any opponent may tap an untapped creature they control. If they do, tap Kraken and create a 1/1 blue fish creature token where this creature can't be blocked. So this calls back to kind of like Desecration Demon. Actually, very, very similar to Desecration Demon. 4 mana, 6/6, a form of evasion. Your opponent can tap their stuff. In the case of Desecration Demon, they actually just sack their stuff rather than just tap it. But they can do something with their creatures to get it out of combat. Is Reservoir Kraken actually good? I don't know. Because you only have to tap a creature to keep it from attacking you by tapping it down, you really aren't losing that much. Like Desecration Demon, eventually, if it sticks out on the battlefield, puts your opponent in a position where they're kind of damned if they do or damned if they don't. They're eventually going to run out of all their creatures, and your opponent's going to have to let you attack with this huge Desecration Demon and win the game. Reservoir Kraken's not going to do that. Rather than eating away your opponent's board, it's just kind of annoying them by making them tap a creature. The upside is you're getting that fish token, so you're potentially not ever attacking with Kraken, but getting a 1/1 fish every turn, is that worth it for 4 mana? I don't really know. It is nice that the fish is unblockable, so I can see uses, but I do think this is probably mostly worse Desecration Demon. The other thing is, it still does die to a lot. Like, Ward 2 is a nice little bonus, but Ward 2 isn't Ward 4 or Ward 8 or some really high number. Like, it's still going to get sniped, and in some ways, being tapped down, kind of a bad thing with, like, Wandering Emperor. Your opponent can just, like, tap a creature to tap your Kraken and then snipe it with Wandering Emperor. It dies to Vanishing Verse and Valorous Dance and many other things. So that is something to keep in mind. Like, it certainly is still killable, even though it has a bit of protection. There are a couple places where it could be interesting. A while ago, we played this mono blue weird tempo-y style deck, where this could be a good addition. It was just all these weird blue tap creatures and theft creatures like Mind Flayer. I could see Reservoir Kraken being pretty good there. Like, Dragon Turtle can tap stuff down. Sure, your opponent can't tap it for Reservoir Kraken. If you do get in hits with it, it's a lot of power and toughness for 4 mana. Like, it's 6/6 Trampler for 4 is above the curve even in 2022. The other possibility is you could play in a control deck, I guess. Like, if you can keep your opponent's board clean, then this is a 6/6 Trampler for 4 because they won't be able to tap creatures to get it out of combat. So that's another option. Maybe you just overload on removal. Is it better than playing another Planeswalker or something? Maybe not. In Commander, I think there's a couple of possibilities. It could go into tap and untap Tribal with Rhoda and Timon. Like, that's one natural home. Maybe even a more common home is going to be Sea Creature Tribal decks. This is just a cheap Kraken. One of the problems with Sea Creature decks in Commander is they tend to be overloaded with like 7 drops, 8 drops, 9 drops, so really, really high-end stuff. So even though Reservoir Kraken, I don't think is super powerful in Commander, 6/6 in a 40 life format isn't that much. It is a cheap tribe member that'll work with your Slinvada synergies or whatever, so that's kind of a nice little upside there. So I think you will play it in Sea Creature decks, even if it is mostly because it's a cheap sea creature rather than its abilities. So Reservoir Kraken, it's neat. My guess is it probably won't be super heavily played, but it is a really interesting design that we haven't seen in quite a while. So I don't know, maybe those fish tokens are going to be even better than I think, and this is going to stick around longer than I think, and it'll end up being a little better than I think. In the world of lower rarity cards, we got a few interesting ones, starting with Tainted Indulgence. 2 mana Dimir instant, draw 2, then discard a card unless there are 5 or more mana values among cards in your graveyard. This card seems really good at instant speed. It reminds me a little bit of Charted Course. Draw 2, discard 1 for 2 mana, instant speed. Even if you don't have those 5 cards in your graveyard, to turn it into a full-on draw 2 can be pretty powerful. Like, getting cards in your graveyard is an upside. So I think that this card's efficiency definitely gives it a chance to see play in reanimation style decks, other decks that want to get cards into their graveyard in Standard, and possibly even in like Pioneer, in Historic, in Modern. So definitely one to keep in mind. We also got maybe one of the best uncommon legends we've ever seen in Rocco Caterer. So normally, when I see Uncommon Legend, I'm ready to be not disappointed because it's an uncommon, but I'm ready for it not to be all that powerful or interesting. Rocco, though, I think is pretty powerful and pretty interesting. It's 3 9 mana plus X for a legendary 3/1 Elf Druid. And it said when it enters the battlefield, if you cast it, you can search your library for a creature card with mana value X or less, put it on the battlefield, and then shuffle. This is a really strong ability. This is Court of Calling. You can't convoke it, but you're getting a 3/1 body, and it can be in your command zone. Court of Calling is a really, really powerful tutor. tutor, when you think about how this plays, let's say you cast this for 6 total mana. You're getting a Woodland Bellower, slightly smaller body, but you get this flexibility. You cast it for 6 mana, you get a 3-drop, any one that you want out of your deck. There's no restriction, non-legendary, green, anything like that. So it's a Woodland Bellower, which is seen play in various decks, and then it scales. If you make a ton of mana, you can get any creature in your deck. You cast it for 3 mana, you can get a 0 mana creature like a Dryad Arbor out of your deck. So I actually think this card has potential to be really good. In Commander, it's probably mostly going to be a combo commander. I imagine that you're trying to set up like Dockside Temur Sabertooth for infinite mana. You like cast Rocco, get your Temur Sabertooth, bounce Rocco, cast it again, get your Dockside, make infinite mana. Then you can bounce Rocco a bunch, bounce Dockside a bunch, tutor through your entire deck with Rocco, make a ton of mana with Dockside Extortionist. If you throw Panharmonicon in the mix, you can do this all with 1 Rocco. You just Rocco for 7 mana, get Sabertooth and Dockside Extortionist. Dockside mana lets you start bouncing Rocco and tutor up everything else and bounce your Dockside and go infinite. So it seems like a really, really easy infinite combo commander. Plus, you can use this to get Kiki plus Restoration Angel, Safi plus Extraction Specialist. So if you're trying to set up a creature-based combo in Commander, this gives you an absurd tutor from your command zone. So I actually think it's going to be a really popular commander. Plus, you can just play it fairly and play a bunch of creatures, make a bunch of tokens, snag a Crater Hoof or something to close out the game. So Rocco, I think, is actually like kind of a playable card. I think it might even have a chance in Modern, as weird as that sounds. If you just cast this for 3 mana, you get a 3/1, and then you get a Dryad Arbor, or maybe an Asmore. Like, that's not bad value. 3 mana, get a 3/3 Asmore, which we'll also find in Underworld Cookbook, and you get a 3/1 Rocco. That actually seems fine. So I think Rocco, definitely one of the better uncommon legends that we've seen in many, many sets. I think it's got a chance in Standard. I think it might even have a chance in Modern, and I think we're going to see it be a really powerful tutory combo commander in Naya. We also got Big Score, 4 mana instant, discard a card, draw 2 cards, make 2 treasures. This is just an upgraded Unexpected Windfall. Unexpected Windfall, kind of a surprise hit. This card, when it was spoiled, it looked fine, but it actually developed into a legit Standard staple, and Big Score is a strictly better version. It's not a hugely better version, but the difference between double red and single red, that is an improvement. So if you're playing Unexpected Windfall, you now just play Big Score, and maybe even scarier, now you can play both of them. There's so many treasure synergies in Standard that I think it's possible there's a deck that wants more than 4 of this effect. So kind of ridiculous to see Unexpected Windfall power crept already. It's only been a couple of sets, but still, I mean, Big Score, we've seen Unexpected Windfall be good. Big Score also going to be very good. Finally today, there are a ton of random commons and uncommons. Too many for me to even show on screen. There was just like 20 or 30 or 40 that have been revealed since yesterday. Mostly just limited stuff, but you should definitely check them all out over at MTGpreviews.com. See if there's anything spicy that sticks out to you. Anyway, that brings us to the end of our daily Streets of New Capenna spoilers for today. So what do you think? What's your favorite card of the day? What are you hyped for? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope y'all enjoyed it. And I'll be back tomorrow with even more daily Streets of New Capenna spoilers. So until then, have an amazing day, and I will talk to you soon. Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, help us out by clicking that like button down below. And to keep up on all the latest and greatest, click that subscribe button. And don't forget to hit that bell icon to get alerts whenever we have new videos. And if you want to, check out some of our other sweet videos here and here.